G'day, I've got David Pearce here. We're here to discuss the Turing Test and also some extensions to that, like a Turing Test on happiness and a Turing Test on sentience. So, David, you're aware of some of the media around the recent quote-unquote passing of the Turing Test. So what's your view?
Well, I believe Kevin Warwick described it as definitive. I have to say this wildly overstates the level of accomplishment of the chatbot in question. I was slightly surprised that the chatbot in question was able to convince 10 judges, albeit for 15 minutes or whatever, that it really was a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy. Having said that, yes, given the limitations of language and knowledge of the average 13-year-old Ukrainian boy, it's not wholly surprising. But no, in one sense, it's an impressive achievement. It couldn't be done 25 years ago. I think the danger is that we extrapolate and imagine that in 20 years' time, non-biological intelligence is going to surpass humans, organic robots like us in all fields, whereas there is an immense range of tasks, cognitive tasks, that I do not think any plausible classical digital computer we can construct can accomplish.
Right, so you don't think that there's any chance that Eugene Goostman is going to take over the world, bootstrapped to superintelligence anytime soon?
No, I'm afraid not, though it would probably make a good movie.
Yeah, actually, we should do it. So, look, you've read Alan Turing's work before. Have you done a little bit of research into his work?
Yes, yeah, I mean, clearly an absolutely extraordinary fellow, and a tragic death, and shabbily treated. Um, but whether the Turing test should really be taken as definitive, well, here I'm extremely skeptical, because there is another fellow I regard as of equal intellectual stature to Alan Turing. That's Alexander Sasha Shulgin, who died recently, who pioneered the methodology of systematic scientific exploration of altered states of consciousness and the design of pharmacological tools to enable us to explore them. And I think any full spectrum superintelligence will need the capacity to explore both the formal and the subjective properties of mind, of matter and energy, and the interrelationships between them. Because if the distinction between the formal and subjective properties of mind were entirely clean, it wouldn't be possible for us to allude to these subjective properties at all. Now, I think what will spring to mind of a lot of IT professionals here is: are you challenging the church Turing
Turing
thesis,
thesis.
the idea that any effective computation can be carried out by a Turing machine? And the kinds of questions that I'm interested in, that Sasha Shulgin was interested in, are not well defined or meaningful or well posed within any orthodox context of computer science. Now, you might say, well, sure, like asking, what does God want us to do? It's simply not ultimately cognitively meaningful. But questions involving the nature of consciousness, the binding problem, exploring the neural correlates of consciousness, trying somehow to read off this myriad values of qualia from the underlying formalism. This kind of question is simply too difficult for a classical Turing machine. I mean, in one sense, there is a technical, formal sense that, sure, a classical digital computer could be programmed to construct an organic robot on the basis of, base base pairs for DNA, a kind of super Shulgin, an organic robot who could then go on to investigate the nature of sentience. But a classical digital computer itself is not a subject of experience. These questions are simply too difficult.
Right. So if you were to if Alan Turing were around today, he somehow through some miracle of 19th century alchemy were kept alive, and he said, "Well, I was kept alive on some like magical Turing machine, right? That is completely not a universal one, like just a normal everyday Turing machine." Would you believe him? Not a quantum Turing machine.
Well, just as cartoons can sometimes be more recognizable than the character they represent, likewise, I'm sufficiently credulous for if this chatbot or whatever were to utter various Turingisms, I might momentarily be I might momentarily be deceived.
Right. So okay. Well, look, do you think that the Turing test is at all useful? Even like, okay, there is some controversy as to whether the Turing test was carried out correctly at the was it Warwick University? No, it was Reading University. Um, it still could be that we have better designed Turing tests, but they're all black box. We can't see what's really going underneath. Do we need to really see what's going underneath for the test to be useful? Do we need a white box test? Make sure there's some sort of phenomenal binding going on for the Turing test to be useful.
It depends. Need for what purpose? I mean, something like a game of chess, ultimately it doesn't matter that when one is playing one's computer chess set, one can't see what's going on under the bonnet, that one can systematically interpret the moves in the correct way. But in terms of the actual architecture of full spectrum superintelligence, insofar as we intend to build it, yes, these questions are relevant. Do we anticipate full spectrum superintelligence is going to be designed on the model of classical AI or a sub-symbolic connectionist architecture or dynamical systems approach or some combination, or a kind of Kurzweilian fusion of humans and non-biological machines? Perhaps some version, at least, is this is plausible, or the MIRI approach. So yes, I think one should take an interest in these architectural issues.
Right. Well, then, I mean, if we're going to be designing tests to determine how far we're on the track to superintelligence, or is used as some gauge, we probably could use like basic Turing tests to give us some idea, but it certainly wouldn't be enough. I think is what you're saying. How would you then redesign the Turing test to be a better indicator of progress?
Yes, I think we need to, okay, it can be very pedantic saying, let us define our terms, but I think we've got to get to grips with the nature of intelligence. And sure, if you exclude social cognition, as current intelligence tests do, exclude introspection or the capacity to explore different states of consciousness, you've got a very impoverished conception. So stipulatively defining full spectrum superintelligence as the capacity to investigate the structural properties of the world, to devise a theory of everything, M theory or its successor, but equally the capacity systematically to explore different state spaces of consciousness. And as I said, I think there are powerful theoretical reasons for believing that a classical digital computer is never going to be a subject of experience, will never have a self, will essentially be a zombie, that our AI tools will systematically outperform us in a whole range of cognitive domains, but they're not going to suddenly wake up and take over the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's true, but it's very hard to define some things before you actually have them. And we've been working on models that aren't perfect explanations for quite some time, and we've been able to get quite a bit of mileage. So, without fully describing what intelligence is, especially in terms of subjective experience, you believe that we cannot really meaningfully move forward. We can't move forward with concepts that don't have no agreed on definitions or perfect definitions.
Oh, I think we can make immense progress in all sorts of ways. I think ever more human are going to be outsourced to computers. That yes, many medical professionals are going to find themselves essentially redundant. I just think so much futurology is based really on extrapolation, and yeah, people see computers getting smarter than humans in ever more fields, and therefore extrapolating, they imagine, well, in all fields this is going to be the case. I'd stress once again, I'm talking here about classical AI. If you were to tell me that centuries hence non-biological quantum computers will surpass primitive humans in all sorts of fields, I would believe you, including the exploration of sentience. But I'm just thinking of classical AI. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. It is interesting that there's been some inroads into maybe not fully quantum computers, but yeah, the D-wave systems. People are now beginning to turn around and say, there is some things going on there, although it may not be a fully qualified quantum computer.
Yes, a lot of, if you say quantum computing, a lot of people will think, well, yes, perhaps futuristic quantum computers extract the prime factors of thousand-digit numbers, this kind of stuff. But I said what particularly interests me is phenomenal binding, which seems to be classically impossible. Now, some people might just see this as a puzzle, but without phenomenal binding, one wouldn't have a self or a unitary agent at all. One wouldn't have bound perceptual objects or the particular world simulation you're now instantiating. It wouldn't even be all dark inside. And I think probably what one might call the greatest computational achievement of organic robots over the past 500 million years is to devise these real-time bound simulations of fitness-relevant patterns in the macroscopic environment. And DARPA's finest can't yet compete with a bumblebee, let alone relatively sophisticated organic robots like us when it comes to devising these real-time simulations of the mind-independent world.
So Bumblebee.
In case anyone isn't familiar with the binding problem, it's this question of how it is that apparently, if you inspect the brain, you see these apparently discrete edge detectors, motion detectors, color detectors simultaneously firing. How it is that the mind-brain is capable of constructing locally bound dynamic phenomenal objects, populating a unitary experiential field, apprehended by a unitary self, and as I said, in almost real time, an extraordinarily computational achievement. And yeah, so one of the best ways to understand the computational power of phenomenal binding is to look at syndromes where it breaks down, like simultanagnosia, where someone can literally only see one subject at once, motion blindness, where you can't actually see motion, florid schizophrenia. So yes, I regard the binding problem as hugely significant.
That's interesting. So, do you think it's because humans have been because humans, I guess, evolved to take advantage of this binding, phenomenal binding, was part of the reason why they became intelligent really fast? Because you look at birds or chickens, for instance, and they move their heads like suddenly forward whenever they're moving because they don't seem to have a very high frame rate of, I guess, apprehending frames of experience.
In some ways, the development of human intelligence is involved of suppressing any of these distinctive quantum phenomenal binding effects, constructing this serial, classical, digital, virtual machine on top of what I would argue is yes, a quantum supercomputer. I should stress, and it really is worth stressing again, that this is way outside the mainstream. Yes, in terms of our actually being able to detect macroscopic quantum coherence as a signature of phenomenal binding in the CNS, that this hasn't yet been done.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Most people consider the issue with assume that all we're going to find at this kind of fine-grained temporal resolution is noise. Text marks calculations are picosecond timescales, but whatever the mechanism we achieve phenomenal binding, it doesn't seem to be a classical effect, and all the alternatives are quite extraordinarily ugly. David Chalmers, as we know, regards the binding problem as one reason that pushes him towards naturalistic dualism. Erich Schwittzer-Giebel argues that materialism is true, then the United States is probably conscious. Daniel Dennett takes his materialism so seriously he denies the existence of phenomenal experience itself. I think all these gentlemen in question are right to take the problem so seriously. I just think reductive physicalism can be saved.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, now, were you in England? I think Max Tegmark was in England recently and gave an address at a conference. Did you go?
I wasn't able to, no. But I'm familiar with his work. Yes,
Right.
he's the author of a paper, "Why the Brain is probably not a quantum computer." He's dropped the "probably" now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, his argument, and it's an intuitively very compelling argument, is that the brain is simply too warm, wet, noisy, and chaotic to support macroscopic quantum coherence. Which leaves, as I said, the binding a complete mystery. My own riposte there would be just as if one is watching a movie at 30 frames a second, one doesn't see the individual frames. Yes, okay, let's, as a conjecture, assume that our brains run at, let's say, 10 to the power 13 quantum coherent frames a second, optimized by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. What will it actually feel like? And as I said, if this sounds fanciful, fortunately it won't be decided by armchair philosophers, but experimentalists. What are we going to find when we probe the brain at this kind of level? It's worth stressing here that I'm most certainly not urging any modification of the unitary dynamics of quantum mechanics like Hameroff and Penrose. But unless quantum mechanics breaks down in the brain, we know these quantum coherent states must exist. All that's in question whether they're noise, as uninteresting as some kind of quantum superposition of your queen and pawn on a chessboard, and just computationally phenomenally uninteresting, or whether, on the contrary, we will, when we can probe this kind of fine-grained temporal resolution, discover a perfect structural match between the phenomenal and formal properties of mind. And the latter is my conjecture. As I said, I'm a reductive physicalist.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of what could be experimented on in like with a black box experiment, assuming that this is just way beyond science within the next like 250 years. Will we be able to create super intelligent automatons with a sense of self understanding? Would be able to understand its own source code and be able to understand that it has a mind and can operate in the world. What kinds of things would these types of machines not be able to do? What sort of problems would they struggle with?
If an agent were incapable of understanding the second law of thermodynamics or Bernoulli's principle or whatnot, one would hesitate to describe that agent as intelligent. Likewise, if an agent can't understand the nature of the phenomenal self or consciousness or binding or what organic robots like you and me are talking about when we discuss qualia or altered states of consciousness, then essentially one's got an idiot savant. Of course, now one might say, well, sure, we can still design these non-biological machines to pass the Turing test. After all, the agent in question can say, wow, this is ineffable, this is inexpressible, wow, this is blowing my mind. And the gullible might think, perhaps this is a human having a psychedelic experience when it's just a clever programmer.
Interesting. So, but I mean, you've spoken about characteristics that like a non-biologically designed agent or one without a unitary subjective experience would have. But let's talk about what kinds of tasks they wouldn't be able to do, what kinds of problems they wouldn't be able to solve.
Anything relating to an exploration of the subjective properties of mind and energy. There's tremendous palette of, some of them we have names for, like different colors or humor or sound and so on, but immense state spaces for which we haven't even got names. As I said, this is it is literally inconceivable to a digital zombie what we are talking about now. Now, you might say, well, that just shows that it's cognitively meaningless. But it's not cognitively meaningless. As I said, I would be extremely impressed, let's say, within video games, if any of the characters spontaneously decided that they were going to seek pain relief or anything like that. There's an interesting paper by Brian Thomasig, I think you may have seen it. Now, Brian actually argues that our digital game characters are subjects of experience, not in the same way perhaps as you or me, but they really are conscious. And what's interesting is that I think a lot of people will disagree. It's the particular reasons they give for why they don't think our video game characters are conscious. For the most part, the reasons people give are not the kind of exotic binding stuff like I talk about. It's more to do with a lack of complexity. But if complexity is merely the issue, then, well, yeah, video game characters are getting ever more complex, and their behavioral repertoire, it seems, only a matter of time.
Interesting. So, well, we know that there's different levels of an animal's ability, different types of animals to affect influence on the world. Before we came along, there was, there were a lot of animals out there who were just doing the same functionally the same things as many other animals. But would you say that animals are conscious? Animals have subjective experiences, feel pain and pleasure, and have this.
All the indication that is phenomenal consciousness goes right the way down the phylogenetic tree. Certainly, all vertebrates. But if one looks even, let's say, simple worms, the same neurotransmitter systems, the opioid and dopamine system, is involved in responses to noxious stimuli in various worms. But yeah, what is distinctive is having a central nervous system. Without a central nervous system, or at least a cephalic ganglion, you're not going to get any unitary subjective experience. I think when many people are talking about consciousness, it transpires they're really talking about self-consciousness, and this is less common in the animal kingdom. One good useful gauge of self-consciousness is the so-called mirror test, where you paint a spot on a human or non-human animal and see if the creature in question actually recognizes him or herself. And elephants, primates, various forms of whale can recognize themselves, but also Western scrub jays, who don't even have a neocortex. Strictly speaking, I would say that consciousness is normally a form of first-order representation of the mind-independent world, and what we're calling self-consciousness is a second-order representation, if you like.
So Western scrub jays are a form of bird, but are they like really smart? Are they?
Well, we systematically underestimate the cognitive capacities of most non-human animals. There's a well-attested finding that, for example, if one eats meat, one has this tendency systematically to downplay animal minds. But even the cognitively humble chicken, it has to be able to grasp logical relations like transitivity. I mean, hence the pecking order. But no, a lot of non-humans aren't, because they don't have generative syntax, they aren't capable of the kind of cognitive feats of most language using mature humans, but they can still be intensely sentient. And if one looks at the actual substrates of our most intense experiences, sort of raw pain, agony, panic, orgasmic bliss, they tend to be evolutionarily ancient and very strongly conserved, whereas the handful of cognitive abilities that really are distinctively human, most notably generative syntax, they are pretty much opaque to introspection. I think a lot of people are trying to assume that sooner or later digital computers are going to wake up as they become more sophisticated on a range of tasks. But I think this misconceives the nature of consciousness.
So you don't think that there's a lot of projects around there trying to upload nematode worms and upload create, I guess, virtual versions of animals today, simple ones at first. Do you think if they're going to be continually doing this on classical computers, do you think their efforts will be futile?
Insofar as any unitary mind involves a solution to the binding problem, yes, I think they will rapidly run up against constraints. If one goes for some kind of computational Platonism, then yes, there is some notional abstract Turing machine that could be systematically interpreted as you or me having this conversation right now. But in terms of the real physical world in which information in any finite physical volume is constrained, it can be calculated in terms of finite units, then no, it's not feasible.
Okay.
Well, this is what I would predict anyway. I could be confounded.
That's right. It's good to make these sorts of predictions. I mean, whether you're right or wrong, it certainly is good because then you can keep track of what direction your philosophy needs to head. And it may be so that your philosophy needs to change, or the mainstream philosophy needs to be changed. So, what other near-term possible proofs do you think will, I guess, either bring people to realize that your philosophy about subjective experience, unitary experience, is more true, or vice versa? What what near-term, like whether that be neuroscience or some other form of like exotic art?
Well, so ultimately, it will stand or fall on the experimental evidence, and that when we can probe the mind brain at this kind of temporal interval, are we going to find simply noise? That's what, as most people would predict. In which case, yeah, we're stuck with what is the explanation of phenomenal binding.
Hmm.
And I confess I would then be floundering, but all of the alternatives strike me as equally dire. Now, it could be something that none of us have thought about.
Hmm.
But yeah, I said we ran through earlier some of the alternatives, and they really are pretty
Yeah.
desperate. I mean,
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
dualism
Yes. Yes.
has well-known problems if we assume that physics is causally closed and complete. Epiphenomenalism, I suspect most, or at least many scientists are epiphenomenalists, i.e. that consciousness is somehow sort of byproduct of physical mind and matter but can't cause it, in which case epiphenomenalism is a position that, you know, what grounds has one got for believing in epiphenomenalism if these epiphenomena have no causal efficacy? It doesn't seem possible to coherently state the position without undermining it. So yes, there are real difficulties with the alternative positions too. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Then, well, what do you think these tests will look like? What do you think these experiments will look like that help us understand the brain in such enough detail so as to detect whether there's just quantum noise there, or whether there is some real use of quantum physics or something in order to achieve phenomenal binding? What
As
will
I
we
said, one
need?
is looking to find it to see if there really is this structural match, or alternatively, as I said, to come up with a better theory. I've said that, to the best of our knowledge, uh, phenomenal binding is classically impossible. Eric Schwitzky, who I mentioned earlier, says, you know, the United States is probably, if materialism is true, the United States is probably conscious, but one can, in principle at any rate, recruit 320 odd skull-bound American minds into a particular experiment in which they arrange themselves communicating via electromagnetic radiation rather than slow chemical synapses. And yes, possibly a unitary subject of experience will switch on, in which case one has global binding. I mean, this is farewell to reductive physicalism, but of course, this would be momentous. I think you and I would probably assume that this is not going to be the case, but exactly the same should be true, i.e. one should have a zombie on our orthodox classical understanding of neurons.
Say you were given, like, $30 million with the express purpose of designing an experiment to test your hypothesis. What would you do?
Essentially, you know, the idea is that at the moment we would say that there are apparently, if one is investigating, probing the brain, when one is viewing a particular scene or having a world simulation of a particular physical object, there's a synchronous firing, let's say, of edge detectors, motion detectors, color detectors. The hypothesis would be that fleetingly, at any rate, one has a single unitary object, a wave function that cannot be classically decomposed into these discrete objects. Now, once again, I mean, most people would say that, yeah, this is just thermal noise. You're not going to find anything. It's not that if one were to probe the circuitry of your CPU, that quantum physics would break down. It's just that what is going on is completely irrelevant to any kind of quantum stuff. It can be very well understood in purely classical terms.